So English 1C is a class that focuses on two things, rhetoric and argument. And so what I wanted to do was to create a lecture in which kind of gives you some background to help us understand rhetoric and argument, since that's going to be the basic foundation for our class. So at the end of this lecture, you're going to watch this video. There are two other videos that I posted, and then there's a discussion board in which I'll ask you to kind of respond to what you think of rhetoric. So in a ground class, normally I'll start off with students, and I tell them this, that rhetoric and argument are linked, that before we can talk about having an argument, we first have to start talking about rhetoric. Rhetoric and argument are linked, and we need to understand what rhetoric is before we can shift to what an argument is. So in a ground class, I'll ask students, okay, let's define what is rhetoric. And generally, you can get kind of three groups of students. You can get the student who is completely panicked, who has never heard the term rhetoric. You can get the student who thinks they've heard the term rhetoric but don't really know what it means. And then you get a few brave students who actually can come up with a definition of rhetoric. So if you're one of those students who feels like you've never heard rhetoric before, this is the first time you've heard the term, you're in the right spot, because I'm going to kind of break down rhetoric for you to give you a better understanding of how rhetoric works. So I think the first thing we have to talk about is who are the people that use rhetoric? Because it's safe to say, even if I don't know what rhetoric is, that we can assume that there are people who use rhetoric. And in a ground class, when I ask, who are the people that use rhetoric, the first group that students can always name is politicians. Even if students have no idea what rhetoric is, they know that politicians are people who use rhetoric. And if you think about it, we got out of a really ugly political campaign last fall, right? And so somewhere along the lines, you probably heard Donald Trump was using rhetoric, or you heard Joe Biden was using rhetoric. Okay, so you might have heard the term, I don't know what it means, but it's safe that we can associate politicians with rhetoric. The second group that's always associated with rhetoric that students always pick is lawyers. Lawyers are always associated with using rhetoric. Now, there are other groups that sometimes students can associate with rhetoric. Sometimes students will say, well, a form of rhetoric might be a book or a newspaper. So that kind of just gives us a sense, okay, there are forms of rhetoric. Now I want to talk about, that didn't work.